We should leave her behind, said Ember. In his heart, Dougal knew the Char was right. However, what he said was, how long do we have to find her? An hour, at the outside, Cranks answered, irritated. One thing I did while I was out was to prepare a small incendiary in my old workshop. The smoke should alert the guards, but by the time they put the fire out, I was planning to be long gone. One thing, said Ember. I also thumped the officer's door and demanded he have a large wagon with supplies ready to go for me by noon. Cranks replied sharply. I have no intention to pick up that wagon, but it will delay them further. And I also left a note for my assistant that stated I was leaving for Alona and putting the Ebonhawk Gate and all attendant responsibilities for dealing with the authorities in his care. He paused a moment, then added, I don't like my assistant that much. Okay, said Dougal. Let's figure half hour at best. He looked at the others. Colleen, any idea where she went? I was asleep, said the Sylvari. And if you're asking about the dream, it doesn't work that way. Fine. You come with me anyway, said Dougal. Ember, brief Cranks on the whys and wherefores of what we're doing. Garlic should understand what we're facing as well. We should be back within a half hour. And if you're not, said Ember. We go with your plan, said Dougal. You leave without us. We'll catch up if we can. Colleen, with me. Dougal stepped out of the building above the warehouse and cursed inwardly. The sky was already starting to lighten in the east, and the city was coming awake. Already the heavy shutters against the night air were swinging open, and a honey wagon drawn by heavy Doliac was rattling along the street. No vanguard in sight, but that was only a matter of minutes. Far in the distance, he could hear bugles sounding reveille. Right, we split up, he said. You go into the city. I'll head toward the Hawk Gates. 10 minutes, then turn back. Don't get lost. She's up on the battlements, said Colleen. I thought you said the dream wouldn't tell you where she was, said Dougal. I still have eyes, said Colleen. She's up there. And Dougal followed her pointing hand to show Riona, in her travelling cloak, up on one of the city's interior walls, looking out past the gates. Dougal set off at once, Colleen following him. He knew the mazework of stairs and streets that was Ebonhawk. The nearest stair up was close at hand. The city itself had been a small fortress, nestled in the southern juncture of the Shiver Peaks and the Blaze Ridge mountain range. The steep mountains on several sides provided an ideal location just north of the Crystal Desert. With the Searing, its location grew in importance, and King Adalburn of Ascalon saw it as an ultimate bastion against the Char incursions. In the end, before the foe fire, he dispatched the Ebon Vanguard here to reinforce it. And reinforce it they did. They spread the initial fortress walls outward, continuing to build as they took more territory against the regular Char raids. They erected the mighty Hawk Gates at the northern entrance to the city. They mined the hills behind the walls for stone, and made more living space for the refugees from the abandoned human cities to the north. And they trained their growing populace in the dangers that stood right outside their gates, from the siege engines of the Char. Dougal knew where Riona stood, and why she was there. From that internal wall, she could see over the lower walls, past the Hawk Gates, and all the way to the fields of ruin beyond. He climbed the stairs 3 at a time, leaving the Sylvari far behind him. Riona, he said, as she jumped at the sound of his voice. She had not heard him approach. Dougal, she said, her voice confused for a moment, almost weak. I didn't hear you. We should go, he said. Cranks is back, and we don't have much time. I know, she said. But look. He followed her stare, and could see it as well, and the sight stopped him in his tracks, as it always did. Far to the north, and west of the city, were the front lines of the Char siege of Ebonhawk. They were positioned at the exact range of the human defensive ballistas, not 1 foot closer or farther away. The front line of the Char entrenchments was a line of war wagons, parked in their positions for so long that trees had grown up next to them, providing shade for their crews. The war wagons were mobile walls of metal, each crowned with a spear-like palisade. Joined together in the field, they were an instant fortification for the Char military camps. Behind them were the camps themselves, and with them a variety of siege engines and military units. Here were siege devourers, living engines of destruction, also equipped with ballista and cannon. In years past, when the Char improved their range, they pelted the walls and closer human districts with heavy stones and burning pitch. When the human machines could reach them, they pulled back farther and established new lines. The Iron Legion, the legion that had the most interest in engines of destruction, had been in charge of the siege for over a century and used the city as a testing ground for its latest developments. There were flames along the line, bonfires and forges and cooking fires for the awakening military units. There was the sound of distant horns, loud, blaring trumpets and drums. The Char were waking to war as well. Dougal looked out and saw what he had seen in his youth, the front lines of the war with the Char. In his days and nights here, in the cauldron of war, every day there had been sallies from the fortress and assaults on the walls. It was a hard, brutal life, and one had become hard in return. Or one left, as he and the others did, leaving Riona behind. Colleen had caught up with them. "We were worried," she said to Riona. "The others are waiting." Riona shook her head and said, "I don't know." "We should go," Dougal repeated, tearing himself away from the sight of what had for so many years been the enemy, and still was. "I think I have to stay," said Riona. "I have doubts about what we're doing. I thought I didn't, but now that I'm back here, I find myself falling back into what I once was. That we should be here, not at the vigil or trying to find lost treasures. We should be here to protect Ebonhawk." "Riona, that's wrong," said Dougal. "We have guards coming up," said Colleen, suddenly and clearly. Dougal looked to his left and saw a pair of vanguard moving along the battlement toward them. They were moving with the slow, relaxed pace of two soldiers near the end of their duty shift. They were not actively seeking Char, who had broken into the fortress city, or the humans that had aided it. For that, Dougal was thankful, but when he turned back to Riona, he saw that her face had fallen, and she seemed on the verge of falling apart. "I will delay them," said Colleen. "You talk to her." Before Dougal could stop her, she moved toward the guards, letting her hood drop to reveal her long, vegetative braids. Dougal turned back to Riona. "This was all your idea," he said firmly. "I know," she said, and sighed deeply, her forehead furrowing. "And when it was just finding you, and then sneaking into an ancient human city, it seemed doable. Now we have picked up a menagerie of cast-offs and volunteers, and the more of our numbers grow, the less likely we are going to succeed." Dougal shrugged in agreement. "The less likely we'll succeed without losing people." Riona lowered her chin to her chest. "We could go off on our own." Dougal started, but Riona continued hurriedly. "2 humans could sneak out of here easier than our clown carnival. Norn, Char, Silvari, and now an Asura? Hardly the easiest party to conceal in open fields. We could reach Ascalon City, retrieve the claw, and return it here to Ebonhawk. Then we could keep it here. It would be a coup, a rallying point for our people." "And for the Char as well," said Dougal. "If the Char thought the claw was here, they would stop at nothing to regain it. It would be worse than the worst of the assaults of 70 years ago, when the Char reached the base of the outer walls and undermined the outer district." "You think so?" said Riona, and slid closer to him, her eyes never leaving the quiet battlefield. "Look at it this way," said Dougal. "The Char want the claw so badly that they're willing to talk about peace with the humans. What do you think?" Riona nodded. "If this truce faction, said Dougal. "Truce faction," repeated Riona. "If they get the claw, they will be able to force the rest of the Char to at least lift the siege and start talking. That's the theory. And then maybe we'll finally get a better view from here." Dougal kept his voice light, but Riona just scowled and stared at the Char front lines. Then she said, "You were right." Dougal looked at her and she continued, "I froze back there at the gate. I thought I could come up with a way to get us all past the guards if there was trouble. But when the time came, I found myself empty. I'm just rattled, second-guessing myself." Dougal's lips became a thin line, and he chose his words carefully. This is about Ember. Do you trust her? Asked Riona. Really? Dougal said, She's a part of your order. She is a crusader for the Vigil. I know, said Riona. And I don't feel that way about General Soulkeeper. She's a Char too, one that fought our people for many years. But the way Ember acts, she reminds me so much of them. She pointed a chin at the distant war wagons. If it helps, I feel the same way, said Dougal. After 5 minutes with Soulkeeper, I could forget she was a Char. She commands naturally, and everything else just flows from that. Ember is part of her people, just like we're part of ours. You can see her struggle when she talks to us. Like I'm struggling, said Riona. Still, I want to know that I am glad I found you. I'm glad you're here. You I trust. She slid close to him, and despite himself, he raised an arm to hold her. The weight of the locket felt heavy around his neck. I trust you too, said Dougal, and this will pass. No matter what that crank says, Soulkeeper's plan is a good one. We will get the claw. Together. Promise. They stood there for a long moment, and Dougal realised he had forgotten about Colleen talking to the guards. When he turned, Riona was still in his arms and the Sylvari was headed toward them, raising her hood again. The guards were wandering back the way they'd come from. Are we ready? Asked Colleen. I think so, said Dougal. Riona separated from him and nodded, and they started down the steps. I had a curious chat with the guards, said Colleen. It is interesting what people will tell you when you look at them with wide eyes and act like you just fell out of the tree. Apparently the siege has been quiet for the past few months, no new assaults from the Char lines, and, more interestingly, a moratorium on this side from sallies and patrols. They say some bigwigs made the decision. The Truce faction, said Dougal, and the Queen. Yes, said Colleen, but it is making everyone here very, very nervous. They are expecting some huge Char assault, and a lot of the human soldiers want to attack now before it comes. You took a huge risk, said Riona. They could have been looking for us. Everyone saw the Char. Most would remember the Norn, said Colleen. Very few would pay attention to the Sylvari in a cloak. How did you explain us? Asked Dougal. They were already at the door of the warehouse. I told them you were young lovers making a rendezvous, said Colleen, and acted like I did not know what that meant. They thought that was amusing as well. By the time they had gotten back to the secret warehouse, the others were ready. Cranks was packing a backpack with numerous small parcels carefully wrapped in waterproof, waxed paper. Ember was fitting herself into the armour Garlic had been carrying on his back, sleek, black lacquered plates that glided silently over each other. For his part, Garlic was stroking his scruffy chin and, for the first time, seemed to be deep in thought. Riona picked up her helmet and quickly strapped on her scabbard. We're late, said Cranks, hoisting the satchel onto his back and grabbing a loose piece of cloth that, only when he put it on his wide head, was recognisable as a hat. He pulled out a small lantern and lit it. You're in your armour, Riona said to Ember, firmly. Cranks pointed out that if we are spotted, whether I am wearing armour or not is a moot point, replied the Char, adjusting her scabbard and resting a hand on a heavy Char-made pistol on her opposite hip. At least have Garlic carry your weapon, said Riona, and wear the shackles. Anger flashed in Ember's eyes, and Dougal added, at least until we're clear of the city. Ember looked at Dougal. Dougal nodded toward Riona. Letting the air out in a long, hissing breath, Ember unfastened her belt and handed it, scabbard, sword, and holstered pistol, to the Norn. Then she held up her wrists once more. Garlic fished out the chains and Riona fitted them, loosely, but locked, once more on her wrists and neck. Until we're clear of the city, said Ember, looking harshly at Dougal. Cranks poked his head through the door, then motioned for the others to follow. It was almost light now, the eastern sky reddening and drawing back the widow's veil that had hung protectively on Ebonhawk. Then something exploded off to the north, just beyond the first wall. Screams and shouts sounded right after, and a call to arms went up among the vanguard. Cranks's letter of resignation. Quickly, but not panicked, the Asura ducked into the mouth of an alley, then hustled everyone in after him. They huddled there in the darkness as a column of soldiers in black and gold uniforms tromped past, racing from their barracks to the, hopefully, now burning shop. Dougal watched the faces of the soldiers as they passed in their hiding place, grim, wary, and determined. These were people who hated their jobs, but were proud to do them and refused to falter for an instant. Dougal had been one of their number, as had Riona. To see them in action again, marching off to protect the city, made him flush with shame for not being among them. He felt grateful that the alley stood shrouded in darkness so that none would see. He expected Cranks to lead them in the direction the soldiers came from, but instead, he plunged them deeper into the alleyway, into a maze of small back passages that snaked between granaries and shuttered workshops. Once they crossed a major thoroughfare, then ducked back into alleyways that even Dougal was unfamiliar with. He figured they were heading west through the city, until at last they reached a dead end with a hatch nearly flush with the ground at its base. Cranks pulled out a key and fitted into a lock on the hatch. He motioned to Gullick, who began struggling to open the heavy iron lid. "Do we really have to go in there?" Dougal asked, peering down into the blackness. He pinched his nose so tight that it hurt, and the stench that escaped from the hatch still made his eyes water. "It's the only way to get out of Ebonhawk without having to deal with the Vanguard," Cranks said. "You could approach the commander and ask him permission to depart, but given the nature of your mission and the fact that he's probably looking for you by now, he'd probably toss you into one of our lovely prison cells." At the mention of Ebonhawk's prison, Dougal glanced at Riona. In the growing light of the morning, he could see the muscles in her face tighten, but she showed no other reaction. "It's too bad the walls are so high," Gullick grunted, straining as he fitted his fingers under an edge and lifted, "and that you're all so small. Were we all Norn warriors, we could just scale the wall and be gone." Despite herself, Riona snorted. "You'd be filled with arrows and rifle shot before we made it halfway to the top. Then the Char would get to shoot at you on the way down." Cranks's lantern light cast deep shadows on the Asura's face. "The Ebon Vanguard built this place to stand against the Char forever," he said. "They drew on the experience Ascalon accumulated during the construction of the Northern Wall, and they've had over 200 years of keeping the Char out of the city to help them figure out where the weak parts are and what they need to do to keep them plugged." "Then, how have you noticed something they haven't?" asked Dougal. Cranks allowed himself a chuckle. "Because I'm Asura, and they're human. They think in terms of reiterations. They build something that they hope will stand, then they shore it up as best they can in the places they get wrong. People with brains think not in terms of single bits like walls, but in terms of systems, especially interlocking systems and how they work together. The thing that lets Ebonhawk survive isn't the wall or the Vanguard. It's the Asura Gate. Without that, the Char would have been able to starve the humans out of here long ago. With it, the humans have managed a record-breaking stand against a truly determined foe." "Granted," said Ember, whose hair bristled at the mention of her people's failure to wipe this settlement from Ascalon. "Many Char believe that Ebonhawk is impregnable, and taking it is a waste of effort, better spent elsewhere. The strongest dissenters are among the Iron Legion. This is why they have taken over the siege. And with their machines, they might someday manage to do it," said Riona, louder than she needed to. "One more reason we must work for this truce." "Breaking down a wall isn't all that challenging, children," said Cranks. "It just requires the right machines, and the Char have developed many crude but effective machines that could manage it. The trick is getting those machines into the right places. The Vanguard has got extremely good at keeping the Char from reaching those places." Gullick hefted the iron hatch again, and it rose another couple of inches. The darkness beyond it gaped like an open, infected wound. "So, why do we have to go down there again?" asked Dougal. "Because there's one spot in the wall that the Vanguard rarely watches and the Char don't attack. The sewage exit. Ebonhawk gets most of its water from streams that flow down into it from the mountains, and they tap an underground river with a few deep wells. But they also need to get rid of all the waste they generate, otherwise the city would eventually be overwhelmed with it. Even under her fur, Ember seemed to be turning a little green. The honey wagons dump the waste into a few well-positioned central depositories, each of which sits downstream from the wells, and the point at which they divert some of the mountain streams into the sewer's main tunnel. The diverted water then carries the refuse under the city until it spills out of the far side of the mountain, a couple of 100 yards away from the wall. Dougal's stomach turned. "You're kidding," he said, although he knew the Asura wasn't. The Asura smiled. "The Char can't stand the smell. Every now and then, the Vanguard sends someone up to check out the sewage tunnel's exit, but he finds it locked up tight, and that's a good enough excuse for them to forget about it. The Vanguard isn't made up of complete idiots. They know about the sewage exit, of course, and they've secured it fairly well against attacks. From the outside." "But not from the inside," said Gullick, who had finally lifted the iron hatch and stood there, splay-legged, holding it up. "By the snow leopard's lazy tail, this just might work." "Might work? Of course it will work. It's foolproof." He scanned the faces of the others. "It has to be when you're working with fools." Ember growled at the Asura, who let out a nervous laugh. Present company partially accepted, of course. "Then we have to go," said Riona. "And now, before the guards are done with Cranks' foolishness and organize a proper search." The set of her jaw told him everything Dougal needed to know. She hadn't lost an iota of her determination. She would do anything to see her mission through. Dougal pointed into the darkness beyond the iron door that Cranks had open. A wrought iron ladder disappeared into the abyss below. "Let's get it over with."